penultimate session of our conference is a conversation among us about the digital conversation between Paul Arthur and Ingrid Mason, our colleagues from Australia. Paul Arthur is the Chair of Digital Humanities at Western Sydney University, and Ingrid Mason is the analyst for Australia's largest e-research support agency called Intersect. They called their conversation Digital Publics, Transformation and Translation. And for my colleagues, for Tony, Ali, and Tammy on the organizing committee, I'd like to offer some observations and maybe some questions for all of us to consider. In the previous session, Michael Carroll drew our attention to Sci-Hub in the US as this illegal but heavily accessed repository of scientific information. And Ingrid, in conversation with Paul, draws our attention to the Data Cube, which turns the model of collecting on its head. Researchers go to the cube. The cube itself, maybe like the Sci-Hub, is meeting the mission of preserving data. So do you, Tony, Ali, and Tammy, think that the cube or the hub idea, the kind of repository, large, perhaps even unlicensed repository, is the way where research is going to be collected and accessed in the immediate, if not distant future? What do you think about the role of the hub or the cube as a repository of research information? Is it something that you discuss in your classes or in your research?
I think part of the challenge is to talk about the scale of data that is available. A major part of this discussion is on findability, searchability, and retrievability of content. Because since earlier this morning we had a number of speakers talking about mass digitization projects like HathiTrust, Google Books, the Digital Public Library of America, and then now with open data and big data and research data repositories mushrooming around, all over the place. So having storage facilities for storing large data sets is one thing, but finding and being able to actually searching and retrieving those in a sort of seamless and structured and organized and unified fashion is going to be the biggest challenge for research repositories.
Right. It's still going to require the professional expertise, is it not, of the librarian and the archivist to prepare, to organize, to catalog this range of material. Would you agree, Tammy?
Yes, absolutely. And I was thinking of the role of librarians. Are they needed with these kinds of repositories? And I've also been struck today thinking about, everyone's been talking about access, but I think what big data presents is the flip side of that, and we have info glut. And so how do we manage when there's so much information, so much data out there? It brings up issues of data literacy. How are we going to analyze this data beyond just capturing it?
Yes.
What data are we going to capture? So there's many, many different issues, I think, that this type of data cube and the Sci-Hub raises.
Right. And I'm wondering in your classes, Tony, and in the curriculum in SLIS, how this issue of assessing a repository or a cube or a hub is undertaken. How do we teach students about the value of a critical intelligence?
I don't want to speak for any particular colleague, what they're doing in their classes, but I believe that we're all doing this in our own way through our own autonomy and academic freedom through critical lenses. I was very much struck by what Mario Hebert said earlier today about his and his colleagues and his community's limited access to databases by virtue of just where he is living and laboring, working out of the University of Sarajevo. And certainly in a course, for example, that I developed for SLIS a number of years ago that is running a fun and interesting class and challenging class to teach at Library and Information Services and Culturally Diverse Society. We read people like Dave Hudson, an academic librarian at the University of Guelph, who prompts us to think about decolonizing systems, de-Westernizing systems, indigenizing systems. And so anything like Sci-Hub or DataCube, I immediately want students to step back and just sort of look at that through an intercultural lens. We had the Alberta Library Conference in Jasper, Alberta a couple weekends ago, and one of our colleagues at SLIS, Michael McNally, co-presented there with Michelle Braley, an academic librarian here at the U of A. But Michael McNally and Michelle Brady presented on open access, and one of the things they did at the end of the presentation, but for context, caution us where the open access movement has started, where it's coming from, how westernized it is. So in terms of Sci-Hub, DataCube, open access, access-related resources, et cetera, what does it point to? What does it not point to? Who's contributing? Who's on the bandwagon to contribute, who's on the bandwagon to get access, and who does it leave out? So I think those are very important pieces. It reminds me of a paper Ali did. We had a Information Ethics and Global Citizenship Gathering Roundtable here in April 2014. And Ali gave a great demonstration of, systematically showing through Western academic research tools, what does that look like? How does information ethics as a field present itself? And we had a great conversation there, and with Ali's disclaimer about using these tools, what do we see? Not using these tools, what would we see? So I think that's the critique certainly that comes up underneath classes, cultural understanding, technical understanding, economic understanding, political, ideological, technological, sociological, and across the curriculum through different courses, all of those things do happen. So there's a great intersectionality. But the idea is to think critically. And that with one solution, you create another set of problems. With one problem, you can create other solutions. But we do think of the global information professions, and we try to take into account where the blind spots are.
Yes, well, one of those blind spots I think Ingrid Mason draws our attention to when she mentions that students from another culture, and this relates to what you've just been saying, Tony, students from another culture aren't coming to the library. And we see sometimes a resistance to the library as a physical structure on campus where students, possibly from a small town, possibly from a very tiny family network, feel alienated actually from the university and certainly from the overwhelming size of the library. Is it your sense as professionals within the School of Library and Information Studies that here at the U of A we still have a resistance on the part of students to be part or to engage with the library? Tammy, you're nodding your head, so you must be aware of this or familiar with this.
Yes, thank you. My research area in information behavior, this would be something that we discuss.
Exactly.
And so there's a lot of research out there that talks about library anxiety that undergraduates experience, particularly as they're moving into these larger institutions, moving from potentially high school libraries. Yes, and when you're just thinking about the information behavior of newcomers to Canada, so not necessarily even within the context of the library, but there's all kinds of cultural issues, social issues, political issues that really do affect how people are using libraries and what their relationship with them are.
And we can actually flip that in the situation today, I mean right now in Alberta, in the week after the Fort McMurray fire, when we see so many displaced families from Fort McMurray arriving in Edmonton and finding their way across this much larger city, yet a larger city where elementary and secondary schools are open to Fort McMurray students, where the physical education facilities at our university are open free of charge to families, where university residences are open to billet families from Fort McMurray, and yet there still must be a terrific sense of being overwhelmed and still, I think, traumatized by the whole issue of having to leave one's home.
Well, the one thing I would just like to add before anyone else speaks is, and it relates to this idea of diversity. So what we know in information behavior is that people seek information and help from people like themselves.
Yes.
So that kind of brings up a whole other issue about who you're going to speak with if and when you do go to the library. Who
Yes.
are you going to ask for information? Who are you going to ask for help from?
It returns us to Konstantina Martzuku's comment at the beginning of our discussion today, that the librarian, in addition to being flexible and interdisciplinary and widely informed, has to be a people person, has to be available and approachable. Tony?
You know, we're all hugely distracted by Fort Mac and the fires, and I donated to the Red Cross, and I'm very proud to see how particularly the Edmonton community is pulling together, but at the same time, I'm really struggling with how the Indigenous communities in this country have been crying for infrastructure and support and help. It's in the media all the time, and we see this outpouring for Fort Mac while there's a petrocultures discourse going on with people on this campus, for example, and it's quite something to witness. This immediate rallying around Fort Mac in the context of petrocultures and this ongoing, sustained lack of attention to a critical situation in the Indigenous communities, which of course TRC is shedding our light on, but trying to witness the two at the same time in
Yes.
media coverage right now is really difficult. I think it's a really critical moment for us to step back and observe what is our role in this, and our role as information professionals. And we're a sister profession in some ways to journalism, for example.
Yeah.
What is our role in how we discuss and interact in this particular moment? While we have TRC calls to action going on at the same time as Fort Mac, and of course those aren't two separate communities, there are Indigenous communities within the Fort Mac
Indeed,
context.
indeed.
But it is something to observe. I haven't quite come to final conclusions yet, except that I'm disturbed.
Well, it recalls for me, I think it's Paul Arthur's comment, that in his view, the sciences have done a better job of communicating with the public than, and they're communicating their pure research, than have the humanities and social sciences. And I'm wondering if you think that's the case. Ali, do you agree
To
with
some
that?
extent, but I think with the sort of recent developments that we have seen in the area of digital humanities, there are
Humanities, yes.
very interesting projects. I mean, both Ingrid and Paul talk about the availability of open digital libraries like HathiTrust. There is citizen science, so citizens can actually contribute if they know how to analyze, visualize, make sense of data. That would be interesting. I read a recent news story about how some researchers would like to look at who influenced Charles Darwin when he was actually writing up his pioneering theory of evolution based on books in HathiTrust, analyzing the text of thousands of pages to see if they can find commonalities and similarities in terms of text, words, term frequency. So I think that is also open to the public. So, Tammy alluded to the importance of data literacy, which actually plays a key role. So we should educate not only information professionals, but the public at large, how they can actually use data to their advantage. And Fort McMurray is a good example. Can we provide real-time data analysis and making sense of data so that we could actually all benefit from or recover from that situation? So it is kind of we are in a very good intersection in terms of the.
I think the time is actually appropriate too if we consider the, the advances in digital literacy and digital access. I think now might be the time for us to interview and encourage evacuees from Fort McMurray, from both Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities, to write up their experiences, to tell us about their experiences, to convey issues of understanding or misunderstanding. It might clarify some of the disconnect that you spoke of, Tony, between the disregard or the perennial devaluing of the Indigenous and this explosive outpouring of charity for evacuees from Fort McMurray. I think what I'm saying is that I think narrative has a great power, and I think if we empower evacuees and people with access to digital materials to tell their story, we will learn in the process.